I will never forget the sight that greeted me on that Christmas Eve. There, on the front porch of my daughter's house, sat my mother Evelyn, 84 years old, shivering against the wind that cut like glass. She had nothing more than a thin sweater draped over her shoulders, her frail body hunched against the biting cold. Snow had already settled on her hair, clinging to the loose strands that escaped her bun, and her hands trembled in her lap as though every bone inside them rattled from the chill. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening from in the comments. For a moment I froze, my breath hanging white in the air. Inside, through the glowing front windows, I could see the golden light spilling across the living room. A tall Christmas tree stood proudly in the corner, its branches heavy with ornaments, its lights blinking in cheerful rhythm. I heard laughter, children's laughter, high and carefree, and the sound of clinking glasses. The warmth of family, the spirit of Christmas. Everything the season was meant to be, all of it was there just beyond the walls. And yet the woman who had given me life was cast outside like an afterthought. I stepped forward, crunching the snow beneath my boots. The porch creaked under my weight, and Mother lifted her head slightly. Her eyes met mine, watery and red from the cold, and she tried to form a smile. "Henry," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "You didn't have to come." My chest tightened. I had only brought a few small presents for my grandchildren. Rachel's 2 little ones loved puzzles and toy trucks. I wasn't planning to stay long, just enough to see their faces light up when they tore the wrapping paper. But now, seeing my mother out here in the freezing dark, every thought of gift-giving vanished. "Mom," I said, softly slipping off my gloves so I could touch her chilled hands. They felt like ice, fragile as twigs in winter. "Why are you sitting out here? Why aren't you inside?" She shook her head faintly. "It's fine. I didn't want to be in the way." The way my mother, who had spent her entire life making sure no one ever went without, who had stretched every penny when I was a boy, so that Rachel and I could eat, who had stood by my father through decades of hard work in the auto plants until the day he passed, the same woman believed she was in the way. On Christmas Eve, I looked past her toward the door. The sound of Rachel's laugh drifted through, mingling with the deeper timbre of her husband, Thomas. The children squealed at something, probably opening one of the early gifts. The contrast cut me to the bone. "Come on, Mom," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, though my stomach churned with anger. "Let's get you inside." But she hesitated, glancing nervously toward the door. That hesitation told me more than any words could. She hadn't chosen to sit outside. Someone had put her here. I drew in a long breath, snowflakes catching in my beard. "Stay with me," I told her, and reached for the door. The hinges groaned as I pushed it open. Instantly, a rush of warm air hit us thick, with the smell of ham and cinnamon. The laughter inside faltered just slightly as the cold followed me in. Conversations dipped, then stopped. I felt dozens of eyes turning my way. Rachel appeared first, carrying a platter of cookies, her cheeks flushed from the oven heat. Her smile faltered when she saw me standing there with Mother at my side. Behind her, Thomas straightened a glass of wine in his hand. The children, Lily and Jacob, sat cross-legged near the tree, their faces innocent, unknowing. Dad, Rachel said quickly, her voice tight. "You came." "Yes," I answered, my tone lower than usual. My hand tightened around Mother's arm, guiding her in. "I came, and I found her outside." The room went still. The only sound was the faint crackle of the fireplace and the rustle of the Christmas tree lights. I didn't speak again just yet. I wanted the silence to do the talking. The shame of it filled the space heavier than any words I could summon in that moment. As I stood there, guiding my mother into the warm light of the living room, a memory pressed itself into my mind. I saw her hands as they used to be, steady, calloused from years of work folding laundry, late into the night stirring pots of stew that somehow stretched to feed us all. She had spent her entire life making sure her children never went hungry, never felt the sharp edge of want even when she herself went without. Now those same hands shook in my grasp, brittle and cold from being left outside. The contrast tore at me. Inside, the smell of roasted ham and cinnamon rolls filled the air. The fireplace crackled, glasses clinked, and voices buzzed with holiday cheer. Outside, only moments ago, my mother sat abandoned in the dark, her breath fogging in the freezing night. It was a picture of everything wrong, with the world drawn in sharp lines I could no longer ignore. I helped her lower into the armchair closest to the fire. She leaned into the cushion, her shoulders sinking, her face softening slightly as the warmth reached her. I stayed by her side, my hand resting protectively on the arm of the chair. Then I turned to face the room. The silence weighed heavy. Every pair of eyes was on me, on her, on the shame that had been dragged inside with the cold. My chest rose and fell with a slow, deliberate breath. The words that came out next carried not just my voice, but decades of gratitude, hurt, and disbelief. Why did you leave her outside? 7 words. That was all. They cut sharper than any shout could have. Thomas blinked, his expression caught between indignation and panic. He let out a forced laugh, shaking his head as though I were the one being unreasonable. She wanted fresh air, he said quickly, his tone sharp with irritation. Don't exaggerate, Henry. It's not what you think. Fresh air. That excuse stung like an insult. I felt the anger rise hot in my throat, but before I could unleash it, Rachel's voice cracked the silence. Dad, please! She cried, tears already filling her eyes. Not in front of everyone. Don't do this now. Her words trembled in the air, more plea than protest. She was caught in the middle, torn between me and her husband, between truth and appearances. I could see it in the way she wrung her hands, in the way her shoulders hunched under a weight no daughter should carry. The guests began to murmur, a low ripple of whispers rolling across the room. Some shifted uncomfortably, others glanced toward the door as though considering leaving. A few stared at Thomas, their brows furrowed in disbelief. The perfect holiday image he liked to project was cracking before their very eyes. Thomas set his glass down on the mantel with a sharp clink. His jaw tightened, the muscles working as he struggled to keep his composure. Henry, he said again, this time lower, almost growling. This isn't the place for drama. She wasn't out there long. I turned slowly, sweeping my gaze across the room. My neighbors, his friends, my grandchildren all watching. They would remember this night no matter how Thomas tried to spin it. It was then that Mrs. Parker stepped forward. Small, wiry, her silver hair pulled back in a bun. She had lived on this street longer than any of us. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had seen too much of life to tolerate foolishness. This isn't how we treat family, she said firmly. Her eyes locked on Thomas, then flicked briefly to Rachel. Not in this town, not anywhere decent. Her words landed like a stone in a pond, sending ripples of shame across the room. Rachel's sobs grew louder, her hands covering her face. Thomas's nostrils flared, his fists clenched at his sides. I said nothing more. I didn't need to. The truth was laid bare for all to see. But inside me, a fire had been lit, one that would not be put out easily. The murmurs swelled until they became a restless tide across the room. People shifted in their seats, coats half slipped over their arms, eyes darting anywhere but toward the hearth. The air smelled less of ham and cinnamon now, and more of tension, sour and heavy. Thomas's face had gone red, not from wine, but from humiliation. He slammed his empty glass down on the table, the sharp crack making a few guests flinch. A vein stood out on his neck as he glared at me, but he said nothing. The silence was worse than any words he might have chosen. Rachel was near the kitchen, her back against the counter, her hands covering her face. Her shoulders shook with sobs, her cries muffled but still audible over the uneasy whispers of the room. I wanted to go to her to comfort her as I had when she was a little girl, but something held me back. She was not just my daughter anymore. She was Thomas's wife, bound to him by choice and compromise. The strings that pulled at her were tangled, and she didn't know how to cut free. I looked at my mother. She sat quietly in the armchair, the firelight painting deep shadows on her wrinkled face. Her lips trembled, and then she whispered something so soft I nearly missed it. I should have stayed home. The words broke me in ways Thomas's excuses never could. My throat burned, and I bent closer to her, shaking my head. No, Mom. You should have been here inside where you belong. But she only lowered her gaze, her humility more painful than anger would have been. The neighbors weren't blind. I caught Mr. Johnson shaking his head, muttering something to his wife as they slipped their coats on. A couple near the tree exchanged sharp looks, then moved toward the door, clearly not wanting to be part of the scene any longer. Each departing step was another nail in Thomas's carefully crafted image. Rachel wiped at her eyes and whispered broken and desperate. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I swear, Dad. I didn't." Thomas cut her off with a raised hand, his jaw clenched. "Enough," he barked. His voice snapped through the room like a whip. "You're embarrassing us more. Embarrassing." That was his concern, not the freezing woman by the fire, not the truth laid bare before their friends, but his pride. Mrs. Parker straightened her small frame, somehow filling the room with more presence than Thomas's broad shoulders ever could. She planted her cane firmly on the hardwood floor, her voice carrying with the authority of someone who had spent her life calling out wrong when she saw it. "Tomorrow," she said, slow and deliberate, her eyes never leaving Thomas's. "Everyone will know what happened here tonight. You can't hide this behind laughter and lights." The hush that followed was suffocating. The Christmas tree lights blinked on and off like the room itself was holding its breath. I felt something shift inside me then. It was more than anger, more than shame. It was resolve. For years I had tried to keep the peace, to believe Rachel and Thomas could manage their own lives without my interference. But tonight had shown me the cost of silence. My mother's dignity had been trampled, and Rachel's spirit was bent under the weight of a man who cared more for appearances than compassion. As I stood there, the decision formed sharp and clear in my mind. I would not let this pass. One by one, the guests began slipping away. Their polite smiles strained, their goodbyes hushed. Coats rustled, boots thudded against the hardwood, and the front door opened and shut with soft clicks that sounded louder than any argument. The room thinned, leaving behind only the weight of what had been revealed. Thomas tried to laugh it off, a hollow sound that fooled no one. He raised his hands as if to calm the few who remained. "It's all been blown out of proportion," he said, forcing a grin. "You know how families get holiday stress, too much wine." But his words rang empty. Even the children, usually so quick to giggle at their father's jokes, stayed silent, their wide eyes darting between him and their grandmother by the fire. The holiday spirit had drained from the room, replaced by something raw and brittle. Rachel moved toward me, then her eyes swollen and red. She reached for my sleeve like she used to when she was small and scared. "Dad, I never wanted this," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I just wanted peace." I placed my hand gently over hers. For a moment I saw the little girl who once clung to me at the county fair, afraid of the Ferris wheel. But now she was a grown woman caught in a web she couldn't untangle. Peace was all she wanted. But peace at the expense of dignity was no peace at all. Behind her, Thomas's composure cracked. He picked up another glass, filled it half-heartedly with wine, then set it down so hard that red liquid sloshed over the rim. "Enough pity," he snapped. "She's fine now, isn't she? Let's not make a spectacle of ourselves." But it was too late. The spectacle had already happened and the audience had seen enough. Mrs. Parker didn't flinch. She stood firm, her cane tapping once against the floor. "You've made your own bed, Thomas." She said, her words sharp and unyielding. "This community doesn't look kindly on those who forget where they came from. You'll learn that soon enough." Thomas's face twisted, his pride bruised deeper than any blow could have managed. He muttered under his breath, but the words didn't carry. I glanced at my mother. She hadn't spoken again since her heartbreaking whisper, but her eyes met mine, now filled with a sadness that pierced me. It wasn't just sadness for herself. It was for all of us, for the broken threads of family and the silence that had let them fray. Something hardened inside me. Watching Thomas squirm, watching Rachel crumple, watching neighbors turn away in disappointment, I realized this night wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning of a reckoning. I straightened my hand, tightening on the back of Mother's chair. My mind was already turning fast and sharp toward steps I hadn't dared to take before. Paperwork. Lawyers. Choices I had avoided for the sake of keeping the family together. But family wasn't supposed to be built on humiliation and fear. As the last guests slipped out into the snowy night, the door closing with a final thud, I caught my reflection in the darkened window. My eyes burned not just with anger, but with determination. The ride home that night was heavy with silence. Snow tapped against the windshield and the wipers dragged it aside in slow, steady arcs. My mother sat in the passenger seat, her frail frame wrapped in the old quilt I kept in the back of the truck. She didn't speak and I didn't press her. The exhaustion on her face said more than words could. The streets of our town were still lit with Christmas lights. I passed houses where families gathered around dining tables, laughter spilling out through windows, shadows moving against curtains. It all looked so warm, so whole. But inside my truck, it felt like another world, entirely one where betrayal lingered in the air, bitter and undeniable. When we pulled into my driveway, I helped her inside, steadying her on the icy steps. My modest home wasn't much compared to Rachel's sprawling house with its polished hardwood floors and vaulted ceilings. But it was safe, it was warm, and it had never turned her away. I eased her into the recliner by my own fireplace and tucked the quilt tighter around her shoulders. "You should rest, Mom," I said quietly. She nodded, closing her eyes, her breathing evening out within minutes. I stayed there for a long while, watching the flames flicker. The room smelled faintly of pine from the wreath I had hung on the wall, though it couldn't mask the sting of everything I had witnessed. My thoughts churned, like the snow still falling outside. Rachel's house. That house had been secured with my name on the papers. Years ago, when Thomas's business had been shaky and they couldn't qualify for the mortgage, I had stepped in. I had believed I was giving them a chance to build stability, a foundation for their children. I had believed I was doing what any father should. But now, as I stared into the fire, I couldn't help but wonder if all I had done was enable Thomas's arrogance and Rachel's weakness. That house, those finances, they were weapons in the wrong hands. I rose slowly and walked down the hall to the small room I called my office. It wasn't much, just a desk, a filing cabinet and shelves lined with photo albums and old keepsakes. The lamp on the desk flickered when I switched it on, throwing light across the familiar mess of papers. I pulled open the bottom drawer of the cabinet. Inside were manila folders thick with documents, mortgage agreements, bank statements, insurance papers, things I hadn't touched in months. My fingers brushed across the labels, and each one brought back the years of sacrifice behind them. There it was, the deed with my name, and Rachel's the co-signed note that had secured the roof over her head. Another folder revealed the financial support I had funneled their way more times than I cared to count. Vacations they couldn't afford but took anyway. Repairs Thomas never saved for. Tuition payments for the kids that I had covered quietly, believing it was for their future. My stomach turned. I had been their safety net, but instead of gratitude, I had watched my mother, our matriarch, left out in the cold like an inconvenience. I leaned back in the chair, the old wood creaking under me, and pressed my palms against my eyes. The anger had cooled into something sharper now, resolve. If Thomas and Rachel couldn't value what they'd been given, then it was time to remind them who had made it possible in the first place. My gaze fell to the phone on my desk. For years I had avoided this step. I had told myself family should be handled within family. But tonight had shown me that silence only bred cruelty. I picked up the receiver, my hand steady. There was one name I hadn't spoken in too long, but I knew exactly who I needed to call. Daniels. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice, rough with age but steady, answered. "Daniels here." For a moment I didn't speak. Memories of a younger time crowded in the two of us, in uniform mud on our boots a lifetime ago. He had always been the sharp one, the man who read the fine print when the rest of us were too tired to care. I swallowed hard, grounding myself in the present. "It's Henry," I said finally. My voice came out low, steadier than I expected. "I need your help." There was a pause, then the sound of a chair creaking. "Henry Collins. Been a while. What's going on?" I glanced toward the living room. From where I sat, I could just see my mother in the recliner, her breathing deep, and even the firelight painting her in shades of gold and shadow. She looked peaceful now, but the image of her shivering on Rachel's porch was burned into me. "I can't explain it all tonight," I said, my throat tight. "But it's family. Papers, deeds, finances. Things I should have handled a long time ago. I need to set it right." Daniels let out a slow hum, the kind he used when weighing the weight of a decision. "All right, come by my office. We'll take a look at everything. You know I don't charge friends, but you better be ready for honesty. You may not like what you hear." "I don't need comfort, Jim," I said, using the name I hadn't spoken aloud in years. "I need clarity. I need this handled." Another pause, then his voice softened. "Tomorrow morning, then. Bring the papers." When I set the phone back in its cradle, the house felt even quieter than before. The fire had burned low, throwing soft embers again in the dark. I walked back into the living room and lowered myself into the chair across from my mother. She stirred briefly, whispering something I couldn't catch, then drifted back into sleep. I studied her face, lined and fragile, and wondered how many times she had endured indignities I never saw. Tonight it opened my eyes, but I suspected it wasn't the first time Thomas had pushed her aside, or the first time Rachel had looked away. The thought made my hands curl into fists. On the coffee table lay the folders I had carried from my office. I spread them out one by one, letting the dates and signatures stare back at me. Each line of ink was a reminder of how far I had gone to protect my family. And now each line was a lever, a way to pull back what had been abused. The storm outside had quieted. Snow blanketed the yard, muting the world into silence. Inside, though, my mind churned with the storm of its own plans, forming, steps aligning. Tomorrow wasn't just about paperwork. It was about dignity, about drawing a line where none had been drawn before. Morning came with the kind of brittle cold that seeps into your bones no matter how many layers you wear. I sat at my kitchen table with a mug of black coffee, the papers spread in front of me like a map of battles yet to be fought. The house was quiet, save for the ticking of the wall clock. Mother was still asleep in the back room, her breathing steady, and for once I let myself believe she was safe. But across town, things were not so still. Rachel's house, the same one I had helped her and Thomas secure years back now, carried a different kind of noise. Later, a neighbor would tell me about the shouting, the crash of something glass against the counter, and the muffled sobs that followed. Thomas's voice carried first sharp as broken glass. "Your father humiliated us last night, Rachel. Do you have any idea what people are saying? He made me look like a fool in front of half the neighborhood." Rachel's reply was softer but no less desperate. "He didn't humiliate you, Thomas. You left Mom out in the cold. People saw." How was he supposed to stay quiet? There was the sound of a fist hitting the table. "Don't twist this around. We can't afford his interference. That house, his name on those papers, is the only reason we're afloat. If he pulls out, we're ruined." I imagined my daughter's face torn between loyalty to her husband and the guilt eating away at her. "He's my father," she whispered. "And Mom? She's 84. "I can't. You can't," Thomas snapped. "You can't stand up to him, that's what you mean. You'd rather take his side, make me the enemy. Well, let me remind you, Rachel, it's not his roof over your head anymore. It's ours. And if we lose it, that's on you." Those words, I was told, broke her. She sobbed quietly by the stove, clutching a dish rag like it could keep her steady. Thomas stormed off, his footsteps heavy across the hardwood, leaving Rachel crumpled in her own kitchen. By Sunday morning, Rachel dragged herself to church. Her eyes were swollen, and her smile, when offered, didn't reach her cheeks. Pastor Williams, a man I'd known since Rachel was a child in Sunday school, caught sight of her as she lingered at the back pew. After service, he approached her gently, his Bible tucked beneath one arm. "Rachel, are you all right?" She forced a nod, but her voice betrayed her. "I'm fine, Pastor. Just tired." He studied her with the kind of patience only a man of his calling could hold. "I know what tired looks like, child. This is different." He lowered his voice. "Honor thy father and thy mother. That's not just scripture, it's the foundation of family. Whatever you're wrestling with, don't let fear or pride drive you away from that truth." Rachel's eyes brimmed again, and she turned quickly, muttering thanks before slipping out into the cold air. That evening, Thomas sat in his study, the curtains drawn. He stared at the ledger on his desk, debts circled in red ink numbers that didn't lie. He muttered to himself, "If Henry thinks he can cut us off, he's mistaken." He reached for the phone, scrolling through a slip of paper he'd tucked away weeks earlier. A name, a number, a different lawyer one, with a reputation for doing what others wouldn't. He dialed, his tone calm, now controlled. "I need to talk about a power of attorney. My father-in-law doesn't know what's best for himself anymore." By Monday, whispers had already reached my doorstep. Mrs. Parker came by with a casserole, her way of softening the blow of the gossip she carried. She set it down on my counter, then leaned on the doorway with her arms folded. "Henry folks are talking," she said plainly, "about last night, about Thomas. They say he's furious that he's blaming you for everything." I sighed, not surprised, but still wearied by how fast word traveled in a town like ours. Let them talk. Truth has a way of rising above the noise. She gave me a look, half sympathy and half warning. "Just Keep your eyes open. Men like him don't lick their wounds quietly. After she left, I sat by the fire again, Mother dozing in her chair. Her frail hands rested in her lap. And I thought of how easily she could be broken. How easily any of us could if left unguarded. That's when the phone rang. It was Daniels confirming our appointment. Bring everything, Henry. We'll sort through it all. Don't delay. From what you've told me, the other side might already be moving. The word stuck with me long after we hung up. The other side. He didn't even know Thomas the way I did, but already he sensed the kind of man he was. Later that week, I caught sight of Rachel outside the grocery store. She was coming out with a bag of apples, her hair tucked under a wool hat. For a second, she looked just like the little girl I used to lift onto my shoulders at the county fair. But then her eyes met mine, and all I saw was torment. "Dad," she started, but her voice faltered. I wanted to reach for her to tell her none of this had to be so hard, but Thomas's shadow was never far. He came striding out a moment later, his hand gripping the cart handle like it was an anchor. His jaw was tight, his smile a brittle mask for the passers-by. "Henry," he said with a nod that was more dismissal than greeting. "Hope you're doing well." Rachel looked between us, her lips parting, as if to say more, but then she dropped her gaze and followed him to the car. I stood there, clutching the cart. I hadn't even filled the sting of that distance heavier than the Michigan snow. That night, while I reviewed the deeds and bank statements again, a thought clawed at me. What if Thomas wasn't just angry? What if he was plotting something larger, something legal? I had seen the way he operated, always grasping, always certain he was the smartest man in the room. It wasn't hard to imagine him sitting across from a lawyer, twisting stories, painting me as the one who had lost his grip. I looked over at my mother, asleep beneath a quilt, her breathing shallow. I tightened my resolve. If Thomas thought he could take control of me, of my name, of the legacy I had built, then he didn't know me at all. The storm that began on Christmas Eve was far from over. In fact, I could feel it tightening now, drawing us all into its center. And I knew one thing with certainty: I wouldn't be caught unprepared again. The next morning I brushed the snow off my old Ford and drove into town. The roads were slick, the kind of winter sheen that made every mile feel longer. By the time I pulled up outside Daniel's office, my knuckles were white from gripping the steering wheel. The office sat on Main Street, tucked between a hardware store and a diner that still smelled of bacon and coffee at all hours. Daniel's name was etched on the glass door, simple and understated. I pushed inside, the bell above the frame jangling. He was waiting for me just as he always had been. Steady, sharp-eyed, gray at the temples, but still carrying himself with the kind of confidence born from decades of navigating other people's storms. He rose from behind his desk and shook my hand firmly. "Henry," he said, "let's get to it." I laid the folders on his desk. Deeds, mortgage papers, the co-signed loan I should have thought twice about years ago. He flipped through them with the patience of a man reading a battlefield map. "You know," I said quietly when Rachel and Thomas came to me, they were drowning. No credit, no savings. I co-signed because I thought that's what a father did. I thought I was giving them a chance. Daniels didn't look up, but his voice was even. And now they think they're entitled to it. That's how it usually goes. I rubbed my temples. Maybe I spoiled them. Maybe I made it too easy. But Thomas, he's not just angry, Jim. He's planning something. I can feel it. That made him set the papers down. He looked me straight in the eye. "Henry, if they push for guardianship, or even power of attorney, they could take everything. Your accounts, your home, your decisions. You'd be a guest in your own life." The words landed heavy like the clang of a gavel in some cold courtroom. I thought of Evelyn sitting in my chair by the fire and Rachel's downcast eyes outside the grocery store. The idea of Thomas holding that kind of power over me made my chest tighten. "So what do?" I asked. Daniels leaned back, steepling his fingers. "You do what you should have done years ago. You protect yourself legally. You create a trust. You decide who benefits and you put it beyond their reach. That way Thomas can yell, he can threaten, he can scheme, but he can't touch the core of what's yours." I let out a slow breath. "A trust. Yes. And I'd suggest naming your mother as co-beneficiary. Keep it in the bloodline, but skip Rachel and Thomas, at least until they prove themselves worthy, which from what I hear might take a lifetime." The thought both steadied me and stung. To cut my own daughter out, it wasn't something I ever imagined I'd have to do. But then I saw again the way Thomas had smirked at me in the grocery lot, and the way Rachel had lowered her eyes like a child caught in a lie. Daniel slid a blank form across the desk. We'll draft the adjustment today, once you sign the balance of power shifts. But Henry, once you take this step, there's no going back. I stared at the form, the pen heavy in my hand. My whole life had been about providing, about making sure Rachel never went without. And now here I was staring at the line where her name would vanish. The pen felt heavier than it should have, like it carried the weight of every choice I'd made for my family. Daniel slid the document closer, his finger resting on the line where my signature would go. This isn't about punishing them, he said, his voice steady. It's about protecting yourself. And your mother. I nodded, but my chest ached. I thought of Rachel as a little girl, her hair in pigtails running across the church lawn after Sunday school. I thought of all the nights I stayed up late balancing overtime checks so she could have her first bicycle, her college tuition, her wedding day. All of it had led to this moment, me holding a pen preparing to cut her name away. I signed. The ink bled across the page, final and undeniable. Daniels gathered the papers carefully, sliding them into a folder. It's done. The trust now holds your property, your accounts, everything of value. You and Evelyn are the beneficiaries. Rachel and Thomas have no legal claim. The word stung even though I knew it was the right move. It wasn't vengeance I felt, not yet. It was survival. Daniels leaned back, his eyes narrowing. Henry, I've seen children drag their parents into probate court. I've seen them fabricate stories, claim diminished capacity, even bring in doctors willing to testify. If Thomas is as calculating as you say, you need to be ready for that. I clenched my jaw. Let him try. I may be old, but I'm not senile, and I'll fight with every breath I have. Daniels nodded approvingly. That's the spirit. Still keep records. Save every receipt, every note. If he pushes, we'll meet him head on. As I stood to leave the folder tucked under my arm, I felt both lighter and heavier all at once. Lighter because the decision had been made. Heavier because I knew the storm hadn't ended. It had only shifted battlegrounds. Outside Main Street bustled with the ordinary rhythm of life. Folks scraped ice from windshields, the diner bell chimed as someone pushed through for coffee, a delivery truck rumbled past. To them, it was just another cold morning. To me, it was the day I quietly redrew the lines of my family. When I got home, Evelyn was awake, knitting by the fire. She looked up at me with a faint smile. You've been busy, she said softly. I sat beside her, the folder resting on my lap. I've made sure you're safe, Mom. Whatever comes, they can't touch what's ours now. She patted my hand, her fingers frail but warm. Sometimes, Henry, love means saying no, even to your own blood. Her words sank into me like scripture. The phone rang just after supper. I knew before I picked it up who it would be. Daniels had warned me that the news would travel quickly, and sure enough, his voice on the other end confirmed it. Thomas knows, Daniels said. He must have caught wind through the county clerk's office. He's not taking it well. I thanked him, set the receiver down, and felt the weight of inevitability press on my shoulders. I'd expected anger, but expecting it didn't make it easier to bear. By the next morning, neighbors were already whispering. At the diner, while I sipped my coffee, I overheard a pair of men at the counter talking. Did you hear Collins pulled everything into a trust? Cut his own daughter out. Thomas is spitting nails over it. I stirred my coffee slowly, the bitter taste steadying me. I didn't bother correcting them. Let the story spread however it wanted. Truth had its own way of shining through. That evening across town, the storm I had braced for finally broke. Rachel told me later how it began, Thomas slamming the front door so hard the windows rattled. His voice already raised, before he even set his coat down. It's your fault, he barked, pacing the living room. You should have controlled your father. You knew what he was planning. And now we're finished, do you understand? Finished? Rachel tried to reason with him, but her voice quivered. Thomas, he had every right. It's his money, his house. We can't just... He cut her off with a snarl. Don't give me that. Don't you dare defend him. You were supposed to stand with me. Instead, you let him humiliate me, and now he's gutted us. She backed toward the fireplace, her hands twisting in front of her. You left Grandma outside Thomas. Everyone saw it. This isn't about humiliation, it's about what's right. For a moment, silence filled the room, thick and suffocating. Then he brought his fist down on the coffee table with a crack that made Rachel jump. "You ungrateful." He stopped himself, chest-heaving, eyes burning with something darker than anger. Then, without another word, he grabbed his coat again and stormed out. The door slammed behind him, leaving the house quivering in his wake. Rachel stood alone in the living room, her breath coming in shallow bursts. She looked around at the home she had once thought was her sanctuary. The family photos on the mantel, the Christmas decorations still hanging limp from the railing, and wondered when it had all become a battlefield. Rachel told me later how the silence after Thomas left was louder than his shouting had ever been. She stood there in the living room, the table still trembling from his blow, the walls echoing with a rage that lingered even after he was gone. She sank onto the couch, her hands pressed to her face. For years she had played the part, obedient wife, dutiful daughter, the bridge between me and Thomas. But that night, the mask cracked. She whispered into her palms, words she hadn't dared to say aloud before. "Stop blaming me. I didn't do this. You did." The house creaked around her, settling in the winter cold. She rose slowly, wandering through the rooms like a stranger in her own home. The children were asleep upstairs, innocent to the storm that had torn through their roof. She paused at the hallway, her eyes falling on a framed photograph that had hung there for decades. It was her mother, my late wife, smiling in a summer dress, standing in front of the old oak tree we'd planted the year Rachel was born. The glass of the frame reflected the dim lamplight, but Rachel's focus was on the eyes. Those eyes had always carried warmth, steadiness, a quiet strength. Rachel reached out her fingers, brushing the frame. A tear slid down her cheek, landing on the wood below. "Mom," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know how to fix this." She stood there for a long time, the house silent, except for the ticking clock and the faint hum of the furnace. In that stillness, something shifted inside her. For the first time, she allowed herself to see Thomas not as her protector, but as the man who had left her grandmother outside in the cold, who had turned their home into a cage of blame and anger. Later, she would tell me that in that moment, looking at her mother's photo, she felt a flicker of resolve. Not enough to act yet, but enough to know the truth that silence was no longer an option. And while Thomas drowned his anger at the bar downtown, Rachel sat alone under her own roof, clutching that photograph, like it was a lifeline, her tears falling freely at last. Across town, I sat by my fire, unaware of her awakening, but feeling in my bones that the tide of this battle had begun to turn. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning, tucked neatly into a plain white envelope that carried the bank's seal. Thomas must have opened it at the kitchen table, Rachel watching from across the room with her hands knotted together. By the time she called me, her voice trembling, I already knew what it contained. The house was no longer theirs to keep. The mortgage, once secured under my name, had been stripped away when I pulled my guarantee. Without it, the weight of unpaid bills and reckless loans came crashing down. The bank demanded immediate action, sell the house, or face foreclosure. I could picture the scene even without being there. Thomas raging, Rachel breaking down in tears. Their perfect picture of suburban success crumbling with one sheet of paper. For years they had leaned on my sacrifices, and now at last the crutch was gone. By the weekend, word had already spread beyond their walls. That's how things worked in a small Michigan town. Secrets didn't stay sealed. They floated through the air like snowflakes carried from porch to porch, diner booths to church pews. At Miller's Diner, where the smell of fried bacon and hot coffee clung to every corner, I heard two old-timers in flannel whisper about it. "Did you hear Thomas Turner's got to sell the house?" Bank's pulling the rug right out from under him. The other shook his head. "That's what happens when you don't treat family right. Folks around here don't forget." At the grocery store, I caught sight of Mrs. Jenkins holding a carton of milk while murmuring to her friend. Imagine leaving your husband's mother in the cold like that. No wonder Henry finally snapped. Even at the gas station, a teenager wiping windshields leaned toward a driver's window and said, "That Turner guy lost his house. Whole streets talking." The gossip swelled like a wave, and by Sunday morning service, it crashed in full force. The church was packed, holiday wreaths still hanging, the organ playing low as folks shuffled into the wooden pews. I sat near the front with Evelyn by my side, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She looked tired but calm, wrapped in a soft shawl that a neighbor had knitted for her. The sermon that day was about humility and grace, but the undercurrent in the room was judgment unspoken, but heavy. When the service ended, people clustered in small groups buzzing with chatter. That's when Mrs. Parker, never one to mince words, raised her voice loud enough for the entire fellowship hall to hear. This Christmas, she said, her eyes fixed on Thomas and Rachel. At the far end of the room, we all learned what ingratitude costs. Her words cut through the hall like a bell, sharp and undeniable. Thomas's jaw tightened. His face flushed red, but he said nothing. Rachel's shoulders slumped. Her head bowed as if the weight of every whisper finally settled on her back. And in that silence, Evelyn shifted slightly beside me. I glanced at her, and for the first time in years, I saw something like peace flicker in her expression. After Mrs. Parker's words rang out, the fellowship hall turned thick with silence. No one wanted to look directly at Thomas, though I noticed the sideways glances, the quiet head shakes. Rachel clutched her purse to her chest, as though it could shield her from the weight of shame pressing down. When we stepped outside into the cold snow drifted gently across the church parking lot. The lot buzzed with hushed conversations. People avoided Thomas, their greetings stiff, their smiles absent. In a town like ours, respect was currency, and he had bankrupted himself overnight. I walked slowly, Evelyn's hand resting on my arm. Her steps were short, careful on the icy pavement. Rachel trailed behind, her head bent low. Thomas stormed ahead, his shoulders squared in anger, fumbling for his keys, as though the clatter of metal might drown out the whispers. It wasn't until later that afternoon, back at my place, that Rachel appeared at the door. Her eyes were red, her coat hastily buttoned, strands of hair clinging to her damp cheeks. She stood there trembling, and for a moment I saw not the grown woman she had become, but the little girl who once clung to her mother's skirt during thunderstorms. "Dad," she whispered, voice cracking. "Is she here? Is Grandma inside?" I stepped aside, and Rachel hurried past me into the living room where Evelyn sat by the fire. My mother's gaze lifted slowly, cautious but soft. Rachel fell to her knees before her, clutching those frail hands, and the words tumbled out like a flood breaking through a dam. "I'm sorry, Grandma. I'm so sorry. I don't know what came over me. I let him tell me what to do. I let fear and pride make me cruel." Her tears spilled onto Evelyn's hands, wetting the paper-thin skin. Evelyn brushed them gently, her touch like the hush of a lullaby. "Child," she murmured, "I never wanted riches or grand gestures. Only kindness. Only to be seen." Rachel sobbed harder, her body shaking, and I had to turn away for a moment. The sound of her breaking was almost too much to bear, even for me. Meanwhile, Thomas did not come. Word had it he spent the day sulking at O'Malley's tavern, nursing bitterness with cheap whiskey. Folks at the bar weren't sympathetic either. More than one man had told him flat out, "You brought this on yourself." Back at my house, Rachel stayed kneeling until her sobs quieted. She finally looked up at me, her eyes swollen. "Dad, can you forgive me? I was blind. I hurt her. I hurt you. I let the fire crackle between us before I spoke." My voice was steady, though it carried every scar of the years behind it. "Rachel, forgiveness isn't mine to hand out like a gift under the tree. It's earned, and sometimes it comes too late. You chose to follow his lead, and this is the path it brought you down. I'll never stop being your father, but I won't shield you from the weight of your own choices." She bowed her head again, silent. Evelyn stroked her hair, frail fingers weaving through the strands, offering the comfort I could not. As I stood watching them, the firelight flickering across the room, the truth settled in my bones like iron. Justice wasn't gentle. It wasn't sweet or warm. It was hard, cold, and necessary. I finally said it aloud, more to myself than anyone else. Justice isn't sweet, it's necessary. The days after Christmas settled like fresh snow, quiet and steady. Evelyn stayed with me in my modest home, her presence filling every corner with a warmth I hadn't felt in years. I made sure her favorite blanket stayed draped across the couch and that her tea was steeped just the way she liked, black, with a touch of honey. She hummed sometimes while watching the fire, soft tunes from decades past, and for the first time in a long while she looked content. I found myself slowing down, matching her rhythm. In the mornings, I'd pour 2 cups of coffee instead of 1. We'd sit at the table by the window, watching the world outside move briskly while we remained still, savoring each sip. Neighbors stopped by with casseroles, pies, and knitted scarves offering kindness that reminded me I wasn't fighting this battle alone. Rachel visited often, though always with hesitation. She'd linger at the door before stepping inside, her eyes searching mine as though for permission. Sometimes she brought groceries, sometimes flowers. Once, she even brought a framed picture of her mother, the woman I had loved and lost. She placed it gently on the mantel and whispered she would want us to heal. I listened, but said little. My heart had been bruised too many times to leap at easy gestures. Forgiveness, I knew, was not a single word but a long road. Rachel seemed to understand. She didn't push. Instead, she sat with Evelyn, holding her hand, reading from old hymnals, or simply sitting in silence. Each tear she shed felt like a step towards something better, but I kept my guard. Thomas, on the other hand, spiraled downward. His pride could not withstand the blow. Without the house, without the financial support, his veneer cracked for all to see. Folks in town spoke of him with disdain. At O'Malley's Tavern, where he once bragged about his business deals, men now muttered about betrayal and cowardice. At church, families avoided his pew altogether. Even at the grocery store, cashiers offered curt words, their eyes sliding past him as if he were already gone. Word spread that he planned to leave town. The shame was too heavy, the whispers too constant. In a community, this close-knit reputation was everything. And Thomas had lost his. I didn't rejoice in his downfall, but I also didn't grieve it. Actions have consequences. For years, he had treated respect as a given, something owed to him rather than earned. Now he would learn the truth the hard way. At night, when the house was quiet, I sometimes thought of Rachel as a child. I remembered the nights she sat at the kitchen table with her school book spread out, her mother guiding her through fractions and spelling lists. I remembered how proud she was the first time she sang a solo at church, her voice trembling but brave. Those memories softened me, yet they also reminded me how far she had drifted under Thomas's shadow. One evening, as Evelyn dozed in her chair, Rachel approached me. Her eyes were swollen from crying, but her voice was steady. "Dad," she said, "I can't undo what I did. But I want to spend the rest of my life proving that I've changed. I don't want my kids to grow up thinking what we did was normal." Her words sank deep, but I didn't answer right away. Instead, I looked over at Evelyn, her chest rising and falling gently, her face lit by the glow of the fire. My mother had endured neglect and humiliation, yet here she was, safe, cherished, at peace. I finally turned back to Rachel. "Actions will speak louder than anything you say. If you mean it, prove it." She nodded, her tears glistening, and for the first time I saw determination in her eyes instead of fear. It didn't take long before Thomas packed up and left. One morning I saw the moving truck outside their house. Boxes were hauled out in silence, no neighbors offering to help, no friendly waves. Curtains twitched, folks watching from behind their windows, but no one stepped forward. By sundown, the truck was gone, and so was Thomas. Rachel stayed behind with the children, moving into a smaller place on the edge of town. She came by often, her kids in tow, shy but curious around Evelyn. Slowly they warmed up, crawling onto her lap, listening to her stories. It was as though a bridge was being rebuilt plank by plank. Rachel never asked for quick forgiveness. She simply showed up steady and humble, letting her actions speak. Around town, the story of that Christmas became something of a parable. At Miller's diner over eggs and toast, old men would shake their heads and remind each other, "You can't turn your back on the ones who raised you." At the grocery store, women whispered as they picked out apples, "Rachel's trying at least." But Thomas, he got what was coming. And at church, Pastor Williams gently worked the lesson into his sermons, reminding the congregation that honoring our parents wasn't just scripture, it was the backbone of decency. Mrs. Parker, never one to miss an opportunity, put it plainest of all. One Sunday after service, she looked around the fellowship hall and said, "If anyone here ever wonders whether ingratitude has a price, just look at what happened this Christmas. None of us are above it." Heads nodded. Voices hummed in agreement. I carried those words with me as I sat on the porch in the evenings watching the sun dip low over the snowy rooftops. Evelyn sat beside me, bundled in her shawl, her face calm. For the first time in years, I felt peace, not because everything was mended, but because truth had been laid bare. Rachel still had a long road ahead. Trust once broken doesn't knit itself back overnight. but I could see she was walking it with sincerity, and maybe that was enough for now. Evelyn smiled when the children played at her feet, and that more than anything told me we were moving in the right direction. As for Thomas, I didn't think of him much. He had chosen his path, and the town had made its judgment. He would have to find his way somewhere far from here, stripped of the illusion of respect he once clung to. Looking back, the whole ordeal taught me something I already knew but needed to feel in my bones again. Justice is never easy, never sweet, but it restores balance, and sometimes that's the best we can ask for. On Christmas night, as the fire crackled and Evelyn hummed a carol under her breath, I found the words that summed it all up. They weren't complicated, but they carried the weight of everything we'd lived through. Christmas is not about gifts, I said softly, more to myself than anyone else. It's about love, gratitude, and honoring our parents. Evelyn smiled, her hand resting gently over mine, and in that quiet moment I knew the lesson would outlive us all. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box to the right.